Hi everyone, and welcome to The Sleepy Scientist. I'm really happy you're here. Tonight, we're going to go on a calm and quiet trip to learn something amazing. So get comfy, take a deep breath, and let's enjoy this peaceful science story together. Before we start, tell me in the comments, where are you watching from and what time is it for you right now? If you like relaxing science videos, don't forget to tap the like button. Now let's begin. In the deep past, before the world knew the comfort of breathable air, Earth's skies were a dull and hazy veil, tinted with the faint browns and reds of gases that cloaked the planet like a heavy, unbroken shroud. The oceans were rich in dissolved iron, dark and metallic, reflecting a dim light from the sun that was weaker than it is today. Life, if it could be called that, existed in the most humble form. Tiny microbial beings drifting in shallow seas, invisible to the naked eye, yet quietly performing one of the most consequential acts in the history of our planet. These ancient cyanobacteria, with their delicate microscopic bodies, had mastered a peculiar form of magic. They could take sunlight, water, and carbon dioxide, and through the patient work of photosynthesis, release oxygen as a byproduct. At first, this oxygen was almost instantly consumed by the oceans themselves, binding with the abundant iron to form solid rust-like minerals that sank to the sea floor in great silent layers. These layers would one day become the banded iron formations we find in ancient rocks, silent geological testaments to a time when oxygen was too precious to escape into the air. In those days, the atmosphere was dominated by gases such as methane and carbon dioxide, both of which nurtured the greenhouse warmth that kept early Earth from freezing under a dim sun. Oxygen was not only absent from the air, it was for much of life a deadly poison. The tiny microbes that ruled the planet were largely anaerobic, thriving in oxygen-free conditions, and any hint of oxygen threatened to disrupt the delicate chemistry of their cells. And yet, the cyanobacteria kept working, their rhythms unbroken, their slow breathing of light and water spilling more and more oxygen into the world. For millions of years, the oxygen they made found willing partners in the oceans and crust, reacting away, disappearing before it could accumulate above the waves. But eventually these sinks began to fill. The iron was largely bound, the chemical reactions in the crust were saturated, and a threshold was reached. Oxygen at last began to linger in the air. It must have been a slow, almost imperceptible change, not a single dramatic moment, but a long dawn that stretched over tens of millions of years. At first the levels were minuscule, just enough to begin oxidizing minerals at the surface, leaving hints of red in soils and stones. But this tiny presence marked a tipping point in planetary history. The sunlight filtered differently through an atmosphere that now contained oxygen. Ultraviolet light began to interact with it, producing the first thin layers of ozone high above, protective shield against the sun's most harmful rays. With ozone came a subtle expansion of habitability, as life in shallow waters could venture a little closer to the surface without the same lethal intensity of radiation. Still, for many of the planet's inhabitants, this change was catastrophic. Oxygen, so gentle and essential to us today, was a biochemical weapon to the anaerobic life forms of the time, tearing apart their molecules, destroying their way of existence. Vast numbers perished in what can be thought of as Earth's first mass extinction. Yet even in this quiet biological crisis, there was an undercurrent of possibility. Oxygen opened chemical doors that had been closed in an anoxic world. It allowed for more efficient energy production in cells, making complex life possible in the distant future. The rise of oxygen changed the very chemistry of the oceans, altering nutrient cycles, creating new ecological niches. Minerals that could not exist before began to form. The air and water, once alien to our senses, began to move slowly towards the conditions that would one day cradle forests, animals, and humans. It was as if the planet itself had drawn its first deep breath, even if it did not yet know how far that breath would carry life. But the transformation was not without instability. The decline in methane, a powerful greenhouse gas, due to its reaction with oxygen, is thought to have triggered one of the most severe ice ages in Earth's history, the Paleoproterozoic glaciation. Ice may have reached near the equator, turning the world into a snowbound sphere for millions of years. In this frozen stillness, life endured in the refuges it could find, clinging to warmth near volcanic vents or beneath the ice-covered seas. Oxygen was rewriting the climate as much as it was rewriting biology. And so the Great Oxidation event was not a single blessing nor a single catastrophe. It was both braided together in a transformation that permanently altered the fate of the planet. Even today, the marks of this ancient shift remain etched in stone and chemistry. The banded iron formations are layered monuments to the slow accumulation of oxygen in the oceans before it spilled into the sky. The red beds in ancient continental rocks tell of the first oxidation of soils. The fossilized traces of early oxygen-producing microbes, though tiny, carry the weight of a planetary turning point. This was the moment, stretched across geological ages, when the Earth shifted from a world ruled by anaerobic shadows to one moving toward an oxygen-rich future. And in this gradual change, we find the earliest chapters of our own story, because without that ancient unseen revolution, no lungs would ever have learned to draw breath, no forests would have swayed in the wind, and no animals would have chased the scent of air. So when we think of the Great Oxidation event, we should not imagine a single day when the world woke to blue skies. Instead, we should picture an era of slow, steady transformation. Oceans clearing, rocks rusting, skies changing hue, and life enduring both the gift and the burden of a new gas in the air. It was the patient work of countless tiny organisms, each cell a lantern releasing a spark of oxygen into the dark. Over eons, those sparks became a glow, then a flame, and finally the full light of a breathable sky. The Great Oxidation event was, in the simplest sense, the world's first breath. And in that breath lay the foundation for everything that would follow. Now imagine the world in the quiet aftermath of that first great breath. The oceans, once opaque with dissolved metals, had begun to take on a clarity they had never known. Where once iron had soaked up the oxygen like an endless sponge, now much of it lay locked in mineral layers at the seafloor, sealed away in the geological archive. The seas reflected the light of the sky in shades closer to the blue we know today, though the sun's glow was still weaker. Its warmth diffused through a veil of ancient haze. Oxygen in the atmosphere continued to rise, not in a straight and steady climb, but in surges and pauses, like the slow breathing of the planet itself. Some scientists believe these fluctuations were driven by the balance between the microbial producers and the shifting chemical demands of the oceans and crust. Others think massive tectonic events, the movements of continents, the eruptions of volcanoes, played their part in controlling how much oxygen could persist. Whatever the mechanism, the world was learning to live with its new atmosphere. the presence of oxygen changed the rules for life. It altered the very pathways by which cells could extract energy from their food. In the absence of oxygen, organisms relied on slower, less efficient processes to break down molecules. But oxygen, reactive and energetic, opened the door to aerobic respiration, a far more powerful way to fuel life. This meant that in the long run, organisms that could tolerate and even use oxygen had a competitive advantage. Somewhere in the ancient seas, the first ancestors of these aerobic life forms emerged, able to survive what had been a poison to so many others. Their cells became more efficient at producing energy, laying the groundwork for complexity, for larger bodies, for movement that was more than just drifting on the currents. In this way, the Great Oxidation event was not just a story of extinction, but of opportunity, the opening of an entirely new chapter in biology. The rise of oxygen also influenced the shape and chemistry of the Earth's surface. Minerals that could not form in a reducing atmosphere began to appear. Copper, uranium, and other metals changed their states, becoming more mobile or more stable depending on the new chemical rules. The soils developed new colours and textures. Rivers carried oxidized sediments into the seas, layering them into the growing geological record. In time, these changes would also affect nutrient cycles, influencing the availability of essential elements like phosphorus, which would in turn shape the productivity of life in the oceans. It was a vast interlinked system, where the breath of microbes in shallow waters could alter the fate of continents and the chemistry of distant seafloors. Yet the oxygen story was far from a smooth ascent. After its initial rise, there were times when oxygen levels may have dipped significantly, plunging back toward lower concentrations before climbing again. Some theories suggest that organic matter buried in sediments, volcanic emissions, and shifting balances of methane and carbon dioxide may have caused these reversals. Each fluctuation brought challenges and opportunities for the life that remained. For the anaerobic survivors, low oxygen intervals were reprieves, allowing them to reclaim old habitats. For oxygen-using organisms, these dips were times of scarcity. Such instability meant that for hundreds of millions of years, life existed in a world where the rules could change without warning, and adaptation was the only constant. The connection between oxygen and climate was also profound. The earlier Great Freeze, perhaps triggered by the destruction of methane through oxidation, had locked the planet in ice for millions of years. Glaciers stretched from the poles toward the equator, grinding mountains to dust, carving valleys, and burying entire regions under frozen silence. Beneath the ice, the oceans continued to support life, but the rhythms were slowed, the productivity reduced. When volcanic activity eventually released enough greenhouse gases to melt the ice, the planet emerged transformed again, with oxygen still a central player in its ongoing evolution. This cycle of freeze and thaw, of oxygen rise and climate upheaval, became a kind of cosmic dance, binding geology, atmosphere and biology together in an intricate pattern. One of the most remarkable consequences of the Great Oxidation event was the creation of the ozone layer. With oxygen in the upper atmosphere, ultraviolet light from the sun began to produce ozone, a molecule that formed an invisible shield against harmful radiation. Before this protection, life was largely confined to sheltered environments, beneath water, within sediments, or under rock layers that could block the sun's harsh rays. With ozone, the surface of the planet became less hostile. It was a quiet gift, one that would not bear its greatest fruit for hundreds of millions of years when plants and animals finally ventured onto land. Even then, the ancient microbes of the Great Oxidation event would be the uncredited architect of that possibility. From a distance in time, the Great Oxidation event appears almost inevitable, as though life's chemistry had been working toward oxygen all along. But it was not a predetermined outcome. The early Earth might have remained an anoxic world if not for the persistence of those tiny photosynthetic organisms and the balance of geological processes that allowed their waste gas to accumulate. If volcanic emissions of reducing gases had been stronger, if tectonic activity had been different, if nutrient cycles had limited the growth of cyanobacteria, the rise of oxygen might have been delayed for billions of years, perhaps long enough to change the trajectory of life entirely. It is humbling to realize that our existence today rests on the narrow success of ancient conditions, a fragile chain of events that tipped in just the right way. In thinking about the Great Oxidation event, it is easy to imagine the slow transformation as a kind of planetary awakening. The Earth's surface, once dark and alien, was learning to host a new kind of chemistry, a new kind of life. The skies were beginning to clear, the oceans to shimmer in different colours, the land to bear the marks of oxidation, and in the hidden places where microbes worked tirelessly, the future was being shaped, not in the grand bursts of sudden creation, but in the patient, steady breath of tiny cells. That is perhaps the most enduring lesson of this chapter in Earth's history, that profound change can be born from the smallest acts, repeated over unimaginable stretches of time until the world itself is remade. In the long quiet after the Great Oxidation event had reshaped the world, Earth entered an age of slow refinement. Oxygen, though still far below modern levels, was no longer a fleeting trace in the atmosphere, but a permanent and defining presence. The planet had crossed a threshold, and there was no going back to the anoxic days. Life, in all its microscopic variety, was reorganizing itself around this new reality. Those that could adapt to oxygen's reactive nature found opportunities in its energy-rich chemistry, while others retreated into the deeper sediments, the oxygen-poor pockets of the ocean, or the dark crevices of the Earth's crust, where the ancient ways could still survive. This division between aerobic and anaerobic worlds would become a lasting feature of biology, a quiet partitioning of life's domains that persists even today in the hidden habitats of our planet. The gradual build-up of oxygen also began to influence the cycles of other elements in profound ways. Nitrogen, a major component of the atmosphere, became bound into nitrates through oxygen-driven reactions, opening up new nutrient pathways for living organisms. Sulfur too entered new chemical forms, altering the balance of marine ecosystems. These shifts created complex feedback loops, where life altered the chemistry of the Earth, and that chemistry in turn reshaped life. It was no longer just the cyanobacteria driving the story. Oxygen had become a central player in an interconnected system linking the sky, the sea, the land, and the living cells scattered among them. With each passing millennium, the invisible bonds between these realms grew tighter, weaving the first threads of the biosphere as we know it. As oxygen rose, it also brought about subtle changes in the physical appearance of the planet. Weathering of rocks increased, releasing minerals into rivers and seas at a faster rate. The colours of the landscape shifted as soils took on deeper reds and yellows from oxidized iron minerals. Shallow seas sparkled under sunlight clearer than before, reflecting a hint of the sky's emerging blue. From a distant vantage, Earth would have seemed a little brighter, a little more alive, as though the very light touching its surface had changed character. And in truth it had. Oxygen not only altered the chemical balance of the air, but also affected how sunlight was scattered and absorbed, giving the world a new visual texture. This transformation was not without further challenges. The reactive nature of oxygen meant that organic matter, once buried and preserved for long stretches, now decomposed more quickly in the presence of oxygen-loving microbes. This sped up the recycling of carbon, phosphorus, and other key elements, changing the pace of ecological processes. For some life forms, this meant more abundant nutrients and faster growth. For others, it meant the loss of stable refuges. The constant interplay between advantage and loss was the undercurrent of this new era, as the survivors of the Great Oxidation event navigated a world that was both more dangerous and more full of potential than the one they had known. In time, oxygen levels stabilized at a plateau far lower than what we breathe today, yet high enough to support the continued evolution of aerobic life. This stability, however, was punctuated by long intervals of fluctuation, as geological and biological forces pulled the atmosphere in different directions. Massive volcanic events could pour reducing gases into the air, temporarily consuming oxygen. Bursts of biological productivity could raise it again. Each oscillation left its own subtle marks in the rock record, a faint echo of the earlier upheavals that had first brought oxygen into the skies. The Earth had entered a kind of dynamic equilibrium, stable enough to allow life to flourish, yet never entirely at rest. Looking back from our oxygen-rich present, it is tempting to see the Great Oxidation event as a necessary step toward complexity, a milestone on the road to plants, animals, and humans. And in a sense it was. Without it, there could be no forests, no lungs, no fires, no rusting metal. Yet it is also important to remember that for most of life at the time, it was a disaster. Entire ecosystems collapsed. Ways of life that had persisted for over 1 billion years vanished, and new forms of existence had to be invented from scratch. It was at once creation and destruction, a reminder that the same forces that make the world habitable for some can render it uninhabitable for others. This duality is the essence of planetary change. The legacy of the Great Oxidation event is everywhere around us. It lives in every breath we take, in the bright colours of oxidized soils, in the very fact that our cells can power themselves efficiently enough to sustain complex thought and movement. It lives in the ozone layer that shields us from radiation, in the rust that flakes from old iron, in the deep red rocks that tell of ancient seas. Even now, in the oxygen minimum zones of the oceans where life clings to the edge of anoxic darkness, we can see the shadow of the world that existed before oxygen came to stay. We live in the long afterglow of that ancient transformation, and every breath is an inheritance from those tiny, unassuming microbes that changed everything. If the story of the Great Oxidation event has a moral, it may be this: profound change does not always announce itself with sudden noise or immediate clarity. Sometimes it begins quietly in small repeated acts that seem insignificant in the moment. The cyanobacteria that filled the oceans with oxygen had no vision of the future they were creating, no awareness that they were setting the stage for creatures that would one day look back and tell their story. They simply lived, and in doing so they altered the course of the planet forever. We are the beneficiaries of their persistence, breathing the air they made possible, and though billions of years have passed since the first whisper of oxygen in the sky, we remain, in the deepest sense, children of that long, slow dawn. Long before the first forests swayed in the wind or the first animals left their footprints on land, there was a world entirely under the rule of the oceans. It was a place of endless waves, where sunlight could only pierce the uppermost layers, and the deep remained in permanent twilight. In those waters lived countless unseen architects of the planet's history, the phytoplankton, microscopic drifters whose delicate bodies floated in the currents. They were small enough to be carried effortlessly by the sea, yet powerful enough in their collective billions to influence the chemistry of the atmosphere. These plankton, like the ancient cyanobacteria before them, were masters of photosynthesis. They took in carbon dioxide from the air and dissolved it from the water, using the sun's light to create food for themselves and, in the process, releasing oxygen. Every day, as the sun rose, they stirred into action, and every night they sank into a quiet drift, waiting for the light to return. Over millions of years, their patient labour would become a pulse that could be felt in the very air we breathe. This invisible forest beneath the waves was not uniform. Different species of phytoplankton thrived in different parts of the ocean, depending on temperature, light, and the availability of nutrients like iron and nitrogen. In the vast blue deserts of the open ocean, nutrients were scarce, and only the most efficient plankton could survive. In coastal waters and upwelling zones, where deep currents brought nutrient-rich water to the surface, blooms of plankton could grow so dense they could be seen from space. These blooms, though fleeting, were like seasonal meadows in the sea, vibrant, teeming with life and supporting entire food chains from the smallest zooplankton to the largest whales. Without them, the oceans would be barren, and the air above would lose one of its greatest sources of oxygen. The connection between these drifting plants and the atmosphere is intimate and immediate. As they photosynthesize, phytoplankton release vast amounts of oxygen into the water, some of which eventually escapes into the air. It is often said that every second breath we take comes from the ocean, and much of that comes from these microscopic beings. But their role in Earth's systems goes beyond oxygen production. When phytoplankton die, some of their carbon-rich bodies sink to the seafloor, effectively locking away carbon for thousands or even millions of years. This biological pump is one of the planet's most important regulators of climate, keeping the atmosphere from accumulating too much carbon dioxide and heating beyond what life can bear. Life in the planktonic world is a delicate balance between growth and predation. Zooplankton, the tiny animals of the sea, graze on phytoplankton constantly, and fish in turn feed on the zooplankton. This constant consumption means that most phytoplankton live for only a few days, their energy passing quickly through the web of life. Yet their sheer abundance ensures that the system continues without pause. In some places, the death of plankton has another consequence. As their bodies decay, they can deplete the oxygen in the surrounding water, creating hypoxic zones where few larger organisms can survive. These low oxygen areas remind us that oxygen production and oxygen depletion are part of the same cycle, and that the balance is easily tipped. The rhythms of phytoplankton are guided not only by sunlight and nutrients, but also by the larger climate patterns of the planet. Seasonal changes in temperature and ocean currents can cause blooms to appear at predictable times, while events like El Niño can shift nutrient availability and alter entire ecosystems. Over geological timescales, the evolution of phytoplankton has been tied to major events in Earth's history, from ice ages to mass extinctions. When conditions are right, they flourish, creating bursts of productivity that ripple through the marine food web and into the atmosphere. When conditions turn harsh, their populations shrink, and the pulse of oxygen they send into the world weakens. Despite their size, phytoplankton have left an unmistakable mark on the geological record. Certain species produce shells made of silica or calcium carbonate, and when they die, these tiny shells settle on the seafloor, building layers of sediment that can be preserved for millions of years. In these layers, scientists can trace changes in ocean chemistry, climate, and productivity, reading them like a diary of the planet's past. The very chalk cliffs that rise along some coast today are the compressed remains of countless generations of plankton, a monument to the power of the small and the patient. It is humbling to realize that our atmosphere, our climate, and much of the life we know depend on the continuous work of organisms that can barely be seen under a microscope. They are fragile, vulnerable to changes in temperature, acidity, and nutrient supply, and yet they are also resilient, adapting to new conditions over time. They remind us that stability in the Earth system often comes from countless tiny processes acting in harmony, and that the loss of even the smallest members of the web can have consequences that echo across the planet. In their drifting simplicity, phytoplankton carry the weight of the sky. If you could drift with the currents alongside the phytoplankton, you would see how the ocean itself becomes a living machine, driven by forces both vast and subtle. Each day begins with the softening light of the sun, penetrating the upper layers of the sea, awakening the plankton from their nocturnal descent. In the darkness below, they have conserved their energy, sinking just enough to avoid predators that hunt by sight. As the light strengthens, they rise again toward the surface where photosynthesis can begin anew. This daily vertical migration is the largest mass movement of life on Earth, involving not just phytoplankton, but also the zooplankton that graze upon them and the fish that follow in pursuit. It is a silent tide within the ocean, a pulse of life that moves not with the moon but with the sun. The balance that sustains this system depends on an intricate exchange of nutrients. In surface waters, plankton rapidly consume the available nitrogen, phosphorus, and iron, leaving the upper ocean depleted by the late summer in many regions. The renewal of these nutrients depends on mixing, the stirring of the water column by winds, storms, and currents, and the seasonal overturning of layers as temperatures shift. In some regions, deep currents rise to the surface in what are called upwelling zones, bringing with them cold, nutrient-rich water that fuels explosive plankton blooms. These blooms can cover hundreds of kilometers, turning the ocean green or milky blue and feeding a cascade of life that includes seabirds, marine mammals, and vast schools of fish. Such productivity hotspots are rare and precious, yet they are also vulnerable, shifting or disappearing entirely if ocean circulation patterns change. The role of phytoplankton in the global carbon cycle cannot be overstated. Through photosynthesis, they draw down carbon dioxide from the air, using it to build their cells. Some of this carbon is returned to the atmosphere when they are eaten or decay, but a fraction sinks to the depths, where it may remain locked away for centuries. This process, known as the biological pump, acts as a natural climate regulator, keeping atmospheric carbon levels in check. Over millions of years, this steady removal of carbon has shaped the climate of Earth, helping to cool the planet and maintain conditions favourable to complex life. Without it, the greenhouse effect might have pushed Earth into an overheated state long ago. Yet the very process that makes phytoplankton the lungs of the ocean also makes them sensitive indicators of environmental change. Shifts in ocean temperature can alter their growth rates and distribution, favouring some species while suppressing others. Changes in acidity driven by the absorption of excess carbon dioxide into the oceans can affect those that build shells from calcium carbonate, weakening them and disrupting food webs. Even small changes in nutrient supply, whether from natural shifts in circulation or from human impacts like agricultural runoff, can cause imbalances, leading to harmful algal blooms. These blooms, often dominated by a species that produce toxins, can kill fish, close shellfish beds, and even affect human health. In such moments, the delicate harmony of the planktonic world reveals how easily it can be disturbed. Beyond their role in oxygen and carbon cycles, phytoplankton also influence the climate through a more subtle pathway: the production of compounds that seed clouds. Certain species release dimethyl sulfide, a gas that escapes into the atmosphere and forms tiny particles around which water droplets condense. These particles can increase cloud cover, reflecting sunlight back into space and slightly cooling the planet. It is an elegant reminder that even the smallest organisms can have planetary scale effects, shaping not only the chemistry but also the very appearance of the sky. The history of phytoplankton is intertwined with some of Earth's most profound evolutionary events. Fossil evidence suggests that they have been present for hundreds of millions of years, adapting to changes in temperature, nutrient supply, and ocean circulation. In some mass extinctions, their numbers plummeted, altering the entire structure of marine ecosystems. In others, they flourished, driving evolutionary radiations in the animals that fed on them. Each shift in their abundance has rippled outward through the web of life, influencing everything from the diversity of fish in the seas to the composition of the atmosphere above. Today, satellites orbiting high above Earth watch for changes in plankton blooms, measuring the colour of the ocean to estimate how much chlorophyll, the pigment of photosynthesis, is present. These observations are more than just scientific curiosity. They are vital to understanding the health of the planet. A sudden decline in plankton productivity could signal deeper problems in the ocean's ability to support life and regulate the climate. Likewise, unusual blooms might indicate shifts in nutrient cycles or the impact of warming waters. In this way, phytoplankton serve as both the foundation of the marine food web and the pulse of the planetary system, their rise and fall echoing through every other form of life. It is perhaps one of the greatest paradoxes of nature that creatures so small can bear such a large responsibility. They will never be seen by most of the beings that depend on them, yet without their constant work, the air would thin, the seas would starve, and the climate would drift into instability. Phytoplankton are not simply passive drifters in the currents. They are the quiet engineers of habitability, endlessly working in the light and dark, in the stillness and the storm, to keep the planet alive. As the story of the phytoplankton unfolds toward its quiet conclusion, it becomes clear that their influence reaches far beyond the boundaries of the sea. The oxygen they release not only sustains the creatures that swim above them, but drifts into the atmosphere to feed the breath of every land-dwelling being. From the smallest insect clinging to the underside of a leaf to the largest mammal roaming the grasslands, each draws life from the unseen labour of these drifting plants of the ocean. Every inhale we take is linked, in part, to the sunlight captured by a cell so small it could rest unseen upon the head of a pin. This connection is ancient and continuous, stretching back to the earliest days when the first photosynthetic organisms learned to turn light into energy. The rhythm of that transformation has not faltered, even as continents have shifted, climates have swung between ice and warmth, and life has risen and fallen in countless forms. In their persistence, phytoplankton embody a truth about the Earth itself. Stability often hides behind constant motion. They drift endlessly, carried by the same currents that move heat across the globe, that mingle waters from the poles with those from the tropics. This circulation ensures that nutrients travel vast distances, that oxygen produced in one place can benefit life in another. It is a planetary scale act of sharing, one that has no conscious intent and yet binds all living things together. And while the great predators of the ocean, the whales, sharks, and giant squid, capture our imagination with their size and power, it is the invisible plankton that support them, layer by layer, through the intricate web of life. Yet the balance they maintain is delicate. A warming climate alters the patterns of ocean mixing, threatening to trap nutrients in the depths and starve the surface waters. Shifts in wind patterns can silence once reliable upwelling zones, robbing entire regions of their seasonal blooms. The increasing acidity of the oceans challenges those plankton that build shells, weakening them and making it harder for them to survive. Even human activity on land, the fertilizers that run off fields, the pollutants carried by rivers, can upset the balance, feeding harmful blooms that choke the life from coastal waters. In this way, the fate of phytoplankton is entwined not only with the natural rhythms of the planet, but with the choices of a single species, our own. The future of these tiny oceanic gardeners is uncertain, but their resilience is written in the geological record. They have survived asteroid impacts, volcanic winters, and global freezes. They have adapted to shifting continents, changing sea levels, and fluctuating climates. Their survival strategies are built into their diversity, thousands of species, each with its own tolerances and tricks for capturing light, storing energy, and finding nutrients. If some falter, others may thrive, keeping the great cycles of carbon and oxygen moving forward. This adaptability offers hope that even in a changing world, the heartbeat of photosynthesis in the ocean will continue. Still, there is a sobering reality in knowing how much of our own stability rests on the continued well-being of creatures too small for most eyes to see. The air we breathe, the food we eat, the climate we live within, all are touched by the rise and fall of plankton populations. Their abundance or decline can tip the balance of ecosystems, alter the chemistry of the seas, and influence the temperature of the planet itself. They are a reminder that life's foundations are often hidden from view, and that the work of sustaining the world is carried out in silence, without demand for recognition. If you were to stand on a cliff above a calm sea at sunrise, you might not see them at all. The surface would reflect the soft colours of the sky, perhaps broken only by the ripples of a passing fish or the distant arc of a seabird. And yet beneath that tranquil face, billions upon billions of tiny cells would be stirring with the day's first light, each one beginning again the ancient cycle of capturing sunlight and turning it into life. They would drift together in vast invisible meadows, feeding the sea, feeding the sky, feeding the breath of every creature that walks, swims, or flies. You would not hear them, but you would be breathing their work. The story of phytoplankton is, in the end, the story of interconnection. It is the story of how the smallest things can shape the largest systems, how the quiet persistence of life in one corner of the planet can sustain the whole. In their constant movement, their unending exchange with the ocean and the air, they remind us that the health of our world depends not on the survival of the grand and powerful alone, but on the well-being of the countless unseen lives that hold the system together. And so, as we draw in our next breath, it is worth pausing to remember that somewhere, far out at sea, a cell has just split in two, capturing the light of a star 93 million miles away, and in doing so keeping the entire planet alive. Before the first great forests or the rise of the vast coral reefs, there was a time when Earth's surface was ruled by stone, water, and a sky that seemed far closer to the ground. In this world, life was not yet diverse in form, but it was already intricate in its relationship with the planet's chemistry. Deep within the crust and across the floor of the ancient seas, the boundaries between life and geology were blurred. Microbes clung to minerals, drawing energy from the Earth's heat and from the slow reactions between rock and water. Some lived in mats so thick they left behind layered fossils called stromatolites, silent witnesses to a time when the surface of the planet was almost entirely shaped by microbial hands. Among these early architects were cyanobacteria, the same kind of organisms that would one day flood the world with oxygen. But here they were still only part of a much larger and quieter story, the ancient dialogue between living things and the minerals they depended on. The surface of the young Earth was constantly being reshaped. Volcanic eruptions spilled new rock across the land and seafloor, black and steaming, full of fresh minerals for life to interact with. Rain and wind broke down these rocks, carrying their chemical gifts into rivers and seas, where they became nutrients for microbes. In return, life itself began to change the face of the land, subtly accelerating weathering processes, pulling certain elements from the rocks and altering the chemistry of the oceans. The relationship was intimate. Without the minerals released by the Earth, early life could not grow. Without life, the pace of mineral transformation would have been slower, the recycling of elements less efficient. The two systems, biological and geological, were not separate, but two threads of the same ancient weave. Over time, certain minerals began to appear in new forms, altered by the byproducts of life. Iron, which had been plentiful in its reduced state in the oceans, began to oxidize when oxygen from microbial photosynthesis encountered it, forming insoluble compounds that sank to the seabed. Sulfur too was transformed, shifting between different chemical states as bacteria used it in their metabolism. These changes left chemical signatures in the rocks, isotopic fingerprints that scientists today can read, tracing the earliest impacts of biology on the planet's surface. What they reveal is that life's influence on the Earth's mineral landscape began long before oxygen filled the skies, and that the groundwork for future transformations was laid in these deep, ancient exchanges. The interplay between minerals and life did more than shape the planet's appearance. It also set the stage for evolutionary innovation. Certain minerals provided catalytic surfaces where complex organic molecules could form more easily, perhaps even helping life begin in the first place. Others acted as reservoirs of essential nutrients like phosphorus, slowly releasing them into the environment in ways that determined the pace and scale of biological growth. The availability of these resources could dictate which organisms flourished and which faded away. In some cases, the scarcity of a single nutrient might have slowed the rise of entire ecosystems. In others, a sudden influx, perhaps from a volcanic eruption or the weathering of a new mountain range, could have triggered bursts of productivity that reshaped the biosphere. As the ages passed, this mineral-microbe partnership became more complex. Microorganisms evolved to exploit new sources of energy, including the oxidation and reduction of metals like manganese and copper. In turn, their metabolic activity altered the chemical environment around them, influencing which minerals could form and where they could persist. It was a feedback loop with no fixed end, each side continuously shaping the other. Even now, billions of years later, this loop remains fundamental to the planet's function. Modern soils are built from the same interplay of weathering rock and microbial life. Hydrothermal vents still host rich communities of organisms that draw their energy from the minerals in superheated water, much as they did in the earliest oceans. What makes this story remarkable is its quiet persistence. While mass extinctions have swept away countless species and geological upheavals have redrawn the map of continents, the basic exchange between minerals and life has never stopped. It is as if the Earth and its living inhabitants have been engaged in an unbroken conversation, trading elements back and forth, changing one another in the process. From the first simple cells to the most complex ecosystems, from the earliest mountain ranges to the soils beneath our feet, this dialogue has been a constant, invisible to most, but vital to all. And it began in a time when the air was still harsh, the sunlight still unfiltered, and the only forests were the mats of microbes swaying gently in the shallow seas. If we could travel back to that ancient world, we would see a planet in constant transformation, each change shaped by the subtle but persistent work of both stone and cell. The continents were smaller, their edges rough and jagged from the violence of tectonic birth. Volcanoes erupted often, their molten flows cooling into new rock that would one day be worn down into sediments. Rain, laced with gases from the atmosphere, fell upon these fresh surfaces, dissolving minerals and carrying their dissolved forms into streams and seas. In the shallow coastal waters, microbial mats spread across the seafloor like living carpets, intercepting these mineral flows and making them part of their own cycles. The microbes themselves left behind waste products and organic matter that over time further altered the chemistry of the surrounding environment. Every grain of sand and droplet of seawater was touched by this quiet partnership, and every change fed back into the system, creating new opportunities for life to expand its reach. In the deep oceans far from sunlight, life gathered around hydrothermal vents, where superheated water rich in metals and chemicals surged upward from beneath the crust. Here, instead of photosynthesis, organisms relied on chemosynthesis, using the energy from chemical reactions to power their growth. These vent communities were oases in the darkness, and they too contributed to the exchange between life and minerals. As vent fluids cooled, metals precipitated out, forming towering chimneys of sulfide minerals. Microbes colonized these structures, breaking down the very compounds they helped create. In turn, their metabolic activity influenced the composition of the vent fluids, altering the minerals that formed in the next cycle. It was a miniature version of the planet-wide feedback loop, condensed into the lifespan of a single vent field. On the continents, weathering slowly released phosphorus, one of life's most vital nutrients, from rocks into the soil and waters. This trickle of phosphorus may have been one of the key rate-limiting factors for early ecosystems. Without it, cells could not build DNA or ATP, the energy currency of life. With it, populations could grow and new layers of complexity could emerge. The rate of weathering was shaped not only by climate and rainfall, but also by life itself. Certain microbes and later, simple plants secreted acids that broke down rock more efficiently, accelerating the release of nutrients. This was the beginning of biological weathering, a process that would become central to the cycling of elements across the planet. As oxygen began to appear in small quantities from early photosynthesis, it reacted with metals in the environment, changing their solubility and availability. Iron, once abundant in its reduced form and easily dissolved in seawater, began to precipitate as oxides when exposed to oxygen, settling into layers on the ocean floor. These banded iron formations recorded the pulses of oxygen production and capture, alternating between dark layers of iron-rich minerals and lighter layers of silica. The process tied together the biosphere, the atmosphere, and the lithosphere in a single rhythm. Microbes produced oxygen, oxygen transformed minerals, and minerals in turn influenced the nutrients available to life. This interdependence also meant that disturbances in one part of the system could ripple through the others. A shift in tectonic activity that created new volcanic arcs could release a flood of nutrients into the oceans, triggering population booms in microbial communities. These blooms could alter the balance of gases in the atmosphere, influencing weathering rates and climate. Conversely, a global cooling event could slow weathering, reduce nutrient input, and contract the range of ecosystems, leading to quieter, more isolated pockets of life. Through it all, the mineral-microbe partnership endured, adapting to each new balance point the planet reached. In modern times, we can see echoes of these ancient processes in environments both extreme and familiar. Acid mine drainage, for instance, is driven by microbes that oxidize sulfur minerals, producing acidic waters that dissolve metals, the same basic chemistry that took place in natural settings billions of years ago. Soils in forests still depend on microbial action to release nutrients from mineral particles, a direct continuation of processes that began when the first microbial films coated bare rock. Even the formation of certain ore deposits, from copper to uranium, can be traced to the activity of ancient microorganisms that concentrated these metals as part of their life process. The story of life in the minerals is thus not a series of separate events but an unbroken chain, stretching from the first cell that clung to a grain of volcanic ash to the complex biogeochemical cycles that sustain the Earth today. It is a story of patience and reciprocity, in which neither partner dominates but both are changed in the exchange. The mountains we see now, the soils that feed our crops, the ores that power our technology, all are shaped in part by the same processes that billions of years ago nurtured the planet's first ecosystems. In that ancient union of stone and cell, the blueprint for a living Earth was written. As the partnership between minerals and life matured, it began to influence not only the chemistry of the Earth, but also its physical landscapes in ways that would be visible across deep time. Mountains eroded under the combined work of wind, water, and living organisms, their sediments carried to distant seas where they settled into layers that would one day become rock again. Each grain of sand, each clay particle, bore the imprint of chemical interactions that began in the mineral lattice and ended in the metabolism of a microbe. Over millions of years, this continuous recycling transformed the planet from a raw, jagged sphere into a more varied and fertile world. One capable of supporting increasingly complex ecosystems. Life, once confined to small scattered niches, began to spread into every environment that the mineral world could make habitable. Oxygen's gradual rise continued to alter the interplay between life and stone. With more oxygen available, new types of chemical weathering took hold, further accelerating the breakdown of rocks and the release of nutrients. This enriched the oceans and soils, but it also meant that certain metals became less accessible, locked away in oxidized forms. Organisms adapted, evolving biochemical strategies to extract what they needed from these new mineral states. Some microbes developed molecules that could bind tightly to metals like iron or copper, pulling them into their cells even when they were scarce. These adaptations were not merely survival tactics, they were innovations that allowed life to exploit new niches, deepening its entanglement with the mineral realm. the feedback loops between life and minerals became increasingly intricate. When life flourished, it intensified weathering, which altered nutrient flows, which then shaped the distribution of life once again. Geological events, such as the uplift of a new mountain range, could reset the balance by exposing vast new surfaces of rock to weathering. Glaciations could grind stone to fine powder, feeding oceans with bursts of nutrients when the ice melted. Even asteroid impacts, catastrophic as they were, contributed to the cycle, scattering fresh minerals across the land and sea, seeding new opportunities for colonization. In every case, the connection between the non-living crust and the living biosphere remained unbroken. By the time complex multicellular life began to emerge, the mineral-life relationship was already an ancient and deeply established foundation. The soils that would one day anchor forests, the sedimentary rocks that would hold fossils, the mineral-rich waters that would sustain coral reefs, all of these were products of billions of years of shared history between stone and cell. The stage for life's great expansions was set not by sudden miracles, but by the persistent, quiet labour of countless microbial generations working in tandem with the Earth's own geological rhythms. The diversity we see today is a direct descendant of that long collaboration, each species drawing on resources shaped by processes far older than itself. Even in the modern age, with our technologies and industries, we remain part of this ancient cycle. The metals we mine from the ground are often concentrated by the work of ancient microbes. The soils we cultivate are sustained by the same mineral-biological interactions that once fed mats of cyanobacteria in shallow seas. The very air we breathe owes its composition in part to the balance maintained by life and minerals over billions of years. We are not separate from this system. We are one of its most recent participants, dependent on its stability, even as we now have the power to disrupt it. The deeper truth revealed by this story is that life and the Earth's physical body are not separate entities interacting across a boundary, but components of a single evolving system. The crust, the atmosphere, the oceans, and the biosphere are all threads in the same fabric, each shaping and being shaped by the others. Without minerals to provide structure, nutrients, and chemical catalysts, life could not have begun. Without life to weather rock, alter atmospheres, and deposit sediments, the Earth's surface would be barren and static. Their union is not an accident, but a defining feature of the planet, one that has made Earth unique among the worlds we know. If we could hold a single rock from billions of years ago and a handful of living soil from today, we would be holding 2 points along a single continuum. The rock would carry within it traces of microbial activity, the subtle marks of ancient life at work. The soil would be a living community in which minerals and microbes still exchange elements in a dialogue that has never ended. In both, the story would be the same, a story of patience, reciprocity, and transformation, told not in words but in chemical bonds and geological layers. And in that story, we would see the unbroken lineage of the planet itself, a lineage in which every living thing, including ourselves, is a chapter still being written. Long before the forests and the grasslands, before the spread of flowering plants and the rise of towering trees, the Earth's green mantle was absent. The continents were largely bare, their surfaces composed of rock, sand, and soil that had never felt the anchor of a root. The oceans, vast and restless, held nearly all of life, while the land was silent except for the wind, rain, and the slow work of erosion. Yet in this quiet, A monumental transformation was beginning, the colonization of land by plants. It was a transition that would not happen in a single surge, but in countless small advances over millions of years, each one pushing the boundary between sea and land a little further. The world that would emerge from this process would be unrecognizable from the one that came before, for it was plants that would paint the continents in green, reshape the atmosphere, and lay the foundation for terrestrial ecosystems. The first pioneers were not plants in the form we know them today, but algae, and simple moss-like organisms that could tolerate the harsh conditions of exposed rock and soil. They faced an environment without the cushioning presence of water, where sunlight was more intense, temperatures swung dramatically, and the pull of gravity was constant and unyielding. Survive, they developed adaptations that would define plant life for the rest of Earth's history. Protective coatings to prevent drying, structures to anchor them to surfaces, and methods to reproduce without relying entirely on immersion in water. These early colonizers were often accompanied by fungi, forming symbiotic partnerships that allowed them to better extract nutrients from the bare mineral surfaces they inhabited. Together, they began to change the chemistry of the land, releasing organic acids that broke down rock into soil and adding the first layers of organic matter to the barren ground. This new soil, though thin and fragile, was enough to support more complex plant forms. Over time, vascular plants, those with specialized tissues to transport water and nutrients, emerged and began to spread. They could grow taller, reach further toward the light, and send their roots deeper into the earth. With height came the ability to capture more sunlight, and with deeper roots came the ability to stabilize soil and access hidden reserves of water. The landscape, once uniform in its barrenness, began to show patterns of life: low mats of mosses, taller stands of primitive ferns, and patches of vegetation clustered near streams and wetlands. Each new generation of plants altered its environment further, trapping sediment, building richer soils, and creating microhabitats for other organisms. The presence of plants on land had profound effects on the atmosphere. Through photosynthesis, they drew carbon dioxide from the air and released oxygen, much as their aquatic ancestors had done in the oceans. But here, on the continents, the scale of the process expanded dramatically. Vast stretches of land could now participate in the global exchange of gases, accelerating the oxygenation of the atmosphere and drawing down greenhouse gases. This shift had climatic consequences. With less carbon dioxide to trap heat, the planet cooled and ice ages became more likely. In this way, the greening of the land was not just a biological revolution, but a climatic one, tying the fate of the atmosphere directly to the spread of plant life. The arrival of plants also reshaped the hydrological cycle. Their roots held water in the soil, reducing runoff and erosion. Their leaves released water vapor into the air through transpiration, helping to form clouds and influence rainfall patterns. Forests, once they formed, became engines of moisture, recycling water within their own systems and even affecting weather far beyond their boundaries. These processes connected land, air, and water in ways that had never existed before, weaving plants into the very fabric of the planet's climate system. As plants spread, they opened the door for other forms of life to follow. Insects and other invertebrates began to exploit the new resources of leaves, stems, and pollen. Amphibians emerged from the water to feed and breed in the moist environments plants created. Eventually, reptiles and mammals would find their place in these new ecosystems, but it was the plants that built the stage on which they could appear. From the smallest moss clump to the tallest tree, every plant became both a habitat and a source of energy for others, turning the once barren continents into vibrant, interconnected webs of life. The colonization of land by plants was one of the most transformative events in Earth's history, rivaling the Great Oxidation event in its impact on the planet's systems. It was not a conquest in the traditional sense, but an unfolding partnership between life and land, each shaping and being shaped by the other. Through their quiet, persistent growth, plants altered the composition of the air, the flow of water, the stability of soils, and the possibilities for all future life. The green world we know today, with its forests, fields, and gardens, is the direct inheritance of that long and patient transformation, a legacy written in leaves and roots across every continent. Once plants had gained a foothold on the continents, their spread was not uniform but shaped by the contours of the land, the availability of water, and the challenges of adapting to new conditions. In low, wet areas near rivers and lakes, moisture-loving plants thrived, forming dense mats and stands that could remain hydrated even during dry spells. On higher, rockier ground, pioneers evolved tougher outer layers to resist water loss, along with root systems capable of seeking out pockets of moisture deep below the surface. Each adaptation allowed plants to push into environments that had been inaccessible before, extending their range from the sheltered valleys to windswept plateaus. Over time, these expansions knit together patches of vegetation into continuous landscapes, creating corridors where life could move freely between habitats. The development of vascular tissues, xylem for carrying water upward, phloem for transporting sugars and nutrients, was a turning point. It freed plants from dependence on constant contact with water and allowed them to grow far larger than their moss-like predecessors. Taller stems lifted leaves into brighter light, and deeper roots anchored plants against the wind, drawing from the underground reserves. This structural leap opened the way for forests, though the first of these were unlike the ones we know today. Early forests were composed of spore-producing plants such as giant horsetails, club mosses, and tree ferns, their trunks rising in thick columns without the broad canopies of later seed-bearing trees. Even so, these ancient woodlands transformed the landscape, shading the ground, slowing the flow of water, and creating cool, humid microclimates beneath their branches. As vegetation spread, the cycling of nutrients on land grew more complex. Fallen leaves, stems, and roots decomposed into the soil, enriching it with organic matter and returning minerals to the ground. Fungi and microorganisms played a critical role in this process, breaking down plant material and making nutrients available to the next generation of growth. These interactions tied plants into a broader web of life, one in which their own remains became the foundation for future abundance. The richer the soil became, the more diverse the plant life it could support, and in turn the more habitats were available for the animals that followed. The atmospheric impact of plant colonization deepened with time. As photosynthesis on land expanded, the drawdown of carbon dioxide accelerated, contributing to global cooling. Some scientists believe that the spread of plants was a major factor in triggering ice ages during the late Paleozoic, when vast swathes of the continents were covered in dense vegetation. The cooling effect was compounded by the weathering of rocks, which plants enhanced through their root systems. As roots penetrated the ground, they broke apart minerals, releasing elements that could combine with carbon dioxide and lock it away in carbonate rocks. This geochemical partnership between plants and the Earth's crust became a powerful driver of climate regulation. Water cycles also became more dynamic, With plants holding moisture in the soil and releasing it into the air, rainfall patterns shifted, becoming more localized and self-sustaining in vegetated regions. Forests in particular acted as pumps, drawing water from the ground and returning it to the atmosphere in a constant flow. This feedback loop allowed regions that might otherwise have been arid to maintain more consistent moisture levels, further supporting the expansion of plant life. In time, the vegetation itself began to influence the shape of the land, slowing erosion, trapping sediments, and even building up layers of peat that would eventually transform into coal under the pressure of geological time. The arrival of plants also redefined the possibilities for animal life. Insects adapted to feed on leaves, stems, and pollen, while others evolved to pollinate flowers, a partnership that would explode in diversity millions of years later. Amphibians found new breeding grounds in plant-covered wetlands, and early reptiles ventured farther from water as vegetation provided both food and shelter. The expansion of plant life created a mosaic of habitats, each with its own microclimate and resources, allowing for the rise of more complex food webs. By shaping both the physical environment and the atmosphere, plants became the architects of entire ecosystems. From a geological perspective, the colonization of land by plants was a slow-motion revolution. It did not announce itself with a single dramatic change, but with the steady spread of green over grey, the gradual softening of bare landscapes into fertile ground. Each root that split a rock, each leaf that fell to decay, each spore carried by the wind, was part of a process that would, in time, transform the Earth into the living planet we recognize today. This transformation was not only biological but planetary, entwining the fate of life with the cycles of air, water, and stone in a way that could never again be undone. By the time plants had woven themselves deeply into the fabric of the continents, the transformation of Earth was unmistakable. What had once been a barren expanse of rock, sand, and scattered microbial films was now a patchwork of green, stitched together by rivers, wetlands, and forests. The air itself had changed in composition, enriched with oxygen and moderated in temperature by the interplay of vegetation, atmosphere, and water. The soils were thicker and richer, holding not just minerals but layers of decaying organic matter that fed the next generation of growth. And above all, the living landscape now supported a diversity of creatures that could never have existed in the world before plants came ashore. The continents had become ecosystems, self-sustaining and interconnected, each shaped by the presence of roots, stems, and leaves. The forests that emerged during this time were unlike the forests of today, yet they were no less impressive in their influence. Towering lycophytes, horsetails, and tree ferns formed dense stands, their trunks reaching high above the ground while their leaves caught sunlight in layered tiers. Beneath their shade, smaller plants thrived in the cool, moist air, while fungi and microbes decomposed fallen wood and leaves into nutrients. The structure of these forests created a new kind of habitat complexity, with distinct layers from the canopy to the forest floor. Insects buzzed through the air, feeding on plant sap or laying eggs in stems and leaves. Amphibians hunted in the damp undergrowth, and early reptiles found shelter among roots and fallen logs. The web of life had become multi-tiered, bound together by the productivity of plant growth and the energy it poured into the system. The climate effects of these forests were profound. By pulling carbon dioxide from the air and releasing oxygen, they altered the balance of greenhouse gases, cooling the planet and making glaciations more likely. Their roots stabilized soils, reducing erosion and sediment runoff into rivers and seas. This stabilization combined with the accumulation of plant matter in wetlands and peat bogs, trapped vast amounts of carbon underground. Over millions of years, these buried plant deposits would transform into coal, storing the energy of ancient sunlight and locking away carbon that might otherwise have warmed the planet. The very energy systems humans rely on today, in the form of fossil fuels, are a direct inheritance of this deep-time plant activity. Water cycles also shifted in lasting ways. Forests and other dense vegetation acted as massive reservoirs, absorbing rainfall, filtering it through the soil, and releasing it slowly back into rivers and the atmosphere. Transpiration from leaves added moisture to the air, influencing rainfall patterns far downwind. This capacity to recycle water meant that large vegetated regions could maintain their own microclimates, sustaining themselves even during dry seasons. Over geological time, this feedback helped create stable climatic zones that further encouraged the spread of life. The arrival of seed plants marked another leap forward. Seeds allowed plants to reproduce without needing a constant supply of water for fertilization, enabling them to colonize drier environments. Seeds also carried stored nutrients, giving young plants a head start in growth and increasing their chances of survival. With this innovation, vegetation spread into uplands, plateaus, and eventually even the driest deserts, wherever some combination of soil, sunlight, and occasional rainfall could support growth. These expansions pushed green life to the farthest edges of the continents, ensuring that no corner of the terrestrial world was entirely untouched by plant influence. The transformation of the land by plants was not a one-way process. As plants reshaped the earth reshaped them. Shifts in climate forced adaptations in leaf size, root depth, and growth patterns. Changes in atmospheric oxygen and carbon dioxide levels influenced photosynthetic efficiency and plant metabolism. Interactions with animals, from herbivores to pollinators, drove the diversification of plant forms and reproductive strategies. Each new challenge spurred a wave of evolutionary creativity, making the plant kingdom one of the most adaptable and diverse groups of organisms on the planet. Looking back, the colonization of land by plants can be seen as one of the great turning points in Earth's history, comparable in scale to the origin of life itself or the rise of oxygen in the atmosphere. It connected the fate of continents to the living biosphere, making the surface of the planet a place where life could thrive not just in isolated pockets but across vast interconnected landscapes. It brought the cycles of carbon, water, and nutrients into a tightly linked system that could sustain complexity, and it laid the groundwork for the emergence of terrestrial animals, including ourselves, by creating the environments in which they could evolve. Today, every forest, grassland, and meadow is a living echo of that ancient transformation. Each blade of grass, each tree trunk, each drifting seed carries within it the legacy of the first plants that crept onto the land and took root against all odds. The air we breathe, the food we eat, and the stability of our climate all trace back to that slow, persistent greening of the continents. And though the details of the species and ecosystems have changed over hundreds of millions of years, the fundamental role of plants as the foundation of life on land has remained constant. In their patient expansion from the water's edge to the high mountains and deserts, plants not only transformed the earth, but ensured that life's story would continue to unfold across every corner of the terrestrial world. Long before the first human eyes turned upward to chart the constellations, the night sky above Earth was a far darker, emptier place. The stars shone as they do now, and the moon traced its silver path but the vast brilliance of the Milky Way and the glittering haze of the cosmos were unaccompanied by the strange shifting lights of the aurora. The poles, cold and quiet, were not yet crowned by their dancing curtains of green, red, and violet. For the aurora to be born, the planet needed something it did not yet have in its early youth: a magnetic shield strong enough to catch and shape the sun's wind, and an atmosphere rich enough to glow when struck by it. This story begins deep within the Earth, in the molten heart where the magnetic field is forged, and it stretches outward to the invisible edge where our planet's breath meets the streams of charged particles flowing from the sun. In the early days of Earth, the sun was a more volatile star, throwing out intense flares and waves of plasma. Without a strong magnetic field, this solar wind could strip away a planet's atmosphere, as it did with Mars, leaving it exposed to the vacuum of space. But Earth, with its molten iron core in constant motion, developed a geodynamo, a churning, convecting engine that generated a protective magnetic bubble around the planet. This invisible shield, the magnetosphere, does more than deflect the solar wind. It guides some of it toward the polar regions where the field lines converge. Here, the particles can slip into the upper atmosphere, colliding with atoms of oxygen and nitrogen, setting them aglow. It is in these collisions that the aurora is born, the night sky becoming a canvas painted by invisible currents of energy. The first auroras on Earth must have been rare and faint, for the composition of the atmosphere was different then, and the sun's behaviour was wilder, more chaotic. Oxygen levels had not yet risen to modern values, and the colours of the aurora would have been influenced by the gases present at the time. As the atmosphere evolved, enriched by the photosynthetic work of cyanobacteria and later plants, the palette of the aurora expanded. Green and red hues from oxygen, purples and blues from nitrogen, and even faint ultraviolet emissions invisible to the naked eye became possible. Over time, these lights grew more frequent, their shapes more varied, until they became the grand displays we know today. Though breathtaking to witness, the aurora is more than a spectacle. It is a visible sign of the constant exchange of energy between Earth and its star. When solar activity increases, the lights become more intense, sometimes visible far from the poles. These geomagnetic storms can disrupt radio signals, interfere with satellites, and even affect power grids, reminding us that the same forces that paint the sky can also ripple through the technologies we depend upon. Yet for most of human history, the aurora was simply a mystery, a shifting, living light that inspired myths, fears, and stories in cultures across the world. Some saw them as omens, others as spirits, still others as the reflection of fires burning beyond the horizon. From a scientific perspective, the aurora is a perfect meeting point between the deep Earth and the far sun. It begins with slow cooling and motion of the liquid outer core, which maintains the magnetic field. That field reaches out into space, shaping the path of the solar wind as it rushes toward us. In turn, the sun's activity is driven by nuclear fusion in its core, sending waves of charged particles outward in all directions. When those particles meet Earth's magnetic field, they are guided down toward the poles, where they crash into the upper atmosphere, transferring their energy in bursts that make the air itself glow. The entire process spans millions of kilometers and scales, from the size of atoms to the size of planets, yet it unfolds in moments, so that a sudden burst of light in the aurora is the result of a journey that began deep in the sun days before. In the polar night, when the sun does not rise for weeks or months, the aurora can be the only movement in the sky. its ribbons and spirals shifting silently over frozen landscapes. The Inuit of the Arctic, the Sami of Scandinavia, and countless other peoples have woven these lights into their cultural memory, interpreting their forms in ways that connect the human story to the cosmic one. Today, with satellites and sensors, we can trace their origin in detail, but the wonder they inspire remains unchanged. Standing beneath a shimmering curtain of green and red, it is easy to feel the pull of both science and myth, to see the aurora as both a product of natural forces and a reminder of the beauty that emerges when those forces meet in harmony. The aurora is, in a sense, a heartbeat of the Sun-Earth connection, a rhythm that has pulsed for billions of years, growing more visible as the planet's atmosphere and magnetic field evolved. It is not merely a phenomenon to observe, but a story to understand, one that begins in the deep interior of the Earth and reaches to the edge of space. And like all great planetary stories, it is one in which we are participants, for the same magnetic shield that shapes the aurora also shelters the air we breathe, the oceans we sail, and the life we live beneath the ever-changing sky. To truly understand the aurora, one must follow the path of the sun's energy from its origin to its final fleeting expression as light in the polar sky. It begins in the heart of the sun, where nuclear fusion transforms hydrogen into helium, releasing immense amounts of energy. Some of this energy takes the form of charged particles, electrons and protons, which stream outward in all directions as the solar wind. Travelling at hundreds of kilometers per second, these particles cross the gulf of space in just a few days, carrying with them the signature of the sun's magnetic fields. When they reach Earth, they meet the outer boundary of the planet's magnetosphere, a vast and invisible shield shaped like a teardrop by the pressure of the solar wind. The side facing the sun is compressed, while the far side stretches into a long tail that trails away into the darkness of space. Most of the time, the magnetosphere quietly deflects the solar wind, guiding particles harmlessly around the planet. But during periods of heightened solar activity, when sunspots appear and solar flares erupt, the solar wind intensifies and shockwaves of energy slam into the magnetosphere. The magnetic field lines vibrate and twist, and some of the incoming particles are funneled down toward the poles, following the invisible paths carved by Earth's own magnetic field. As they spiral along these lines, the particles accelerate, colliding with atoms and molecules in the upper atmosphere at altitudes between 100 and 300 kilometers. These collisions transfer energy to the atmospheric gases, exciting their electrons to higher states. When the electrons drop back down, they release photons, tiny packets of light, in colours determined by the gas involved and the altitude of the collision. Oxygen, when struck at high altitudes, produces a deep red glow, while at lower altitudes it gives off the vivid green most often associated with the aurora. Nitrogen adds shades of blue and purple, creating the layered curtains and rippling arcs that stretch across the sky. The shapes of these lights are sculpted by the structure of the magnetic field and the variations in solar wind intensity, producing arcs, spirals, and shifting waves that seem almost alive. These patterns can change in seconds, as if the sky itself were breathing in a rhythm set by the sun. Though the beauty of the aurora is often celebrated, its appearance is also a signal of space weather conditions that can have far-reaching effects. The same magnetic storms that light up the polar sky can induce currents in long electrical lines, disrupt satellite communications, and interfere with navigation systems. In extreme cases, they can even cause power grid failures, as happened during the famous Quebec blackout of 1989. For scientists, monitoring the aurora is not just an act of appreciation, but a necessary part of understanding the health and stability of our technological world. Satellites track the flow of solar particles, ground-based observatories photograph and analyze auroral shapes, and instruments measure the fluctuations in magnetic fields that accompany the light shows. Despite its potential for disruption, the aurora is also a gift. It is one of the few natural phenomena that connect us visually to forces acting far beyond our atmosphere. Standing beneath it, you can witness the trace of events that began on the surface of a star, travelled millions of kilometres through space, and ended in a dance of colour above your head. This connection is a reminder that Earth is not an isolated world, but part of a larger cosmic system shaped and influenced by the Sun in ways both visible and invisible. The aurora is not unique to Earth. Similar displays have been observed on other planets with strong magnetic fields and atmospheres, such as Jupiter and Saturn. On these worlds, the colours and shapes of the aurora differ, shaped by the composition of their atmospheres and the power of their magnetic fields. Observing auroras beyond Earth helps scientists understand the dynamics of magnetic fields, atmospheres, and solar-wind interactions across the solar system. It also offers clues to the conditions that might exist on planets around other stars, where similar light shows could mark the presence of protective magnetic shields and atmospheres capable of supporting life. On Earth, the aurora has inspired awe for as long as humans have been able to look upward. Ancient peoples told stories of spirits dancing in the sky, of fires burning in the heavens, of omens heralding great change. These stories reflect not just curiosity, but the recognition that the aurora was a bridge between the everyday world and the vast, mysterious forces beyond it. Today, even armed with a scientific understanding of plasma physics, geomagnetism, and atmospheric chemistry, we can still stand in silent wonder beneath the same shifting lights, feeling the pull of that ancient connection. When the sun is quiet, the aurora retreats to its polar home, faint and rare, but when the sun grows restless, the lights come alive, surging in brightness and expanding toward lower latitudes. In those moments, millions of eyes turn upward, watching as the Earth's magnetic field catches the wind from a distant star and turns it into beauty. The science tells us how it happens, but the experience, the sense of being part of something vast and timeless, belongs to anyone who has ever stood beneath a night sky and seen it come alive with colour. In the quiet darkness of the polar night, when the air is still and the snow reflects every faint shimmer of light, the aurora becomes something more than a phenomenon. It becomes a companion to the landscape. The ribbons of green, edged with violet or deep crimson, stretch across the horizon and ripple in silence, their movement so fluid it seems the sky itself is breathing. Sometimes they hang motionless, as if holding their breath, and then, without warning, they surge and twist, a sudden cascade of light spilling downward like a moon made of colour. For those who live beneath these lights, they are not rare events but seasonal presences, woven into the rhythm of life as naturally as the turning of the seasons or the arrival of migrating animals. Yet even for those accustomed to them, each display feels new, shaped by the unseen pulse of the sun. This intimacy with the aurora has inspired not only myths but also careful observation. Long before the science of space weather was known, Arctic and subarctic cultures learned to read the behaviour of the lights, noting how their colours, speed and patterns seemed to change with the seasons, or with shifts in the wind and temperature. Some stories spoke of them as guides for hunters, others as the spirits of ancestors, and still others as omens of change or warning. In each telling, the aurora bridged the gap between the human world and the cosmic one, serving as a reminder that the forces shaping our lives often originate far beyond the horizon. In the modern era, we can watch the aurora from satellites orbiting hundreds of kilometers above Earth, seeing it from above as a shimmering oval encircling each pole. These ovals expand and contract with the flow of the solar wind, their edges rippling with bursts of light where streams of particles plunge into the atmosphere. Scientists now understand that the aurora is not merely a surface glow, but the visible tip of a vast and dynamic system of energy exchange between the Earth and the Sun. Beneath the lights, electrical currents flow through the atmosphere, magnetic fields stretch and snap in the magnetotail, and waves of charged particles travel along invisible lines from space to Earth. It is a choreography measured in both seconds and millions of kilometers, as if the planet and its star were locked in a dance too large for us to see all at once. The beauty of the aurora often hides the fact that it is also a form of space weather. During strong geomagnetic storms, the same currents that produce brighter and more widespread auroras can induce powerful surges in electrical systems, disrupt navigation satellites, and interfere with radio communications. These storms are reminders that the Earth's magnetic field is not an impenetrable wall, but a living shield, constantly adjusting to the sun's moods. For most of history, such disruptions had little impact on daily life, but in the modern world, with its dependence on interconnected technologies, the aurora's bright surges are both a spectacle and a warning. Yet there is something deeply grounding in the knowledge that the aurora, for all its complexity, is a universal language between planets and stars. It is the same on Jupiter, where massive magnetic fields and volcanic activity on its moon Io create auroras far more powerful than Earth's. It is the same on Saturn, Uranus and Neptune, though painted in different colours by their unique atmospheres. It may even be the same on worlds beyond our solar system, wherever magnetic fields stand against the winds of their suns. In each case, the aurora is a sign of a protective shield, of a planet capable of holding on to its air and perhaps to life itself. On Earth, the aurora's legacy is not only in the scientific records and satellite images, but in the personal memories of those who have seen it. A traveller in the far north might remember standing alone on a frozen plain, the snow creaking underfoot, the silence so complete that the faint rustle of one's own clothing feels loud, and then, above, the first ripple of light appears, followed by another, until the sky is a living sea. A child might recall seeing the lights for the first time, their face turned upward in wonder, asking questions no one could fully answer in that moment. These experiences root the aurora in human memory, making it not just a phenomenon of physics, but a part of our shared cultural and emotional heritage. Perhaps that is the most enduring truth of the aurora. It exists at the meeting point of science and wonder, where explanation does not erase mystery but deepens it. We can trace its origins to the molten motions of Earth's core, to the fusion in the sun's heart, to the pathways carved by invisible magnetic lines through the cold vacuum of space. We can measure the energies, predict the patterns, and capture the colours in precise photographs. Yet none of this diminishes the feeling of standing beneath it, knowing that the light you see began its journey days ago inside a star, and has travelled millions of kilometres only to spend its last moments dancing across your sky. The aurora is both an answer and a question, a reminder that we live within a system far greater than ourselves, and that beauty often emerges at the boundaries where worlds meet.